What if the oldest words ever written weren't meant to document the birth of humanity, but to preserve the memory of what came before us? What if the clay tablets we call the beginning of history are actually the ending of a story we've forgotten how to read? In the silent archives where ancient things sleep, there are fragments that refuse to fit. Wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud 5,000 years ago that describe a world where humans didn't exist yet, not as myth, not as poetry, as record. Before we drift deeper into this mystery, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely drawn to the kind of history that asks more questions than it answers. And if you're still here in the quiet hours, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your world. I like to imagine these stories unfolding across time zones, carried softly towards sleep. Now, let the world grow dim, let the present fade, and follow me back to the clay. The story begins not in Mesopotamia, but in silence. The kind of silence that exists before sound has meaning, before language has formed, before consciousness has learned to recognize itself in the mirror of existence. The Sumerian tablets describe this silence. They call it the time before time, the age before the sky had been separated from the earth, when there was no above, no below, only the primordial waters, endless and undifferentiated, waiting in the dark. But here is what makes the Sumerian account strange. They don't describe this as the beginning of everything. They describe it as the state between endings, as though creation itself were cyclical, as though worlds rose and fell like breath, and what we call the origin was simply the most recent inhalation. In the beginning, the tablets say, there was Namu, not a goddess in the way we imagine gods today, with personalities and preferences and human-like desires. Namu was something older, something that existed before the categories of divine and mortal had been established. The primordial sea, the cosmic ocean, the waters that held all potential but manifested nothing, existence in pure possibility, reality before it had collapsed into form. The Sumerians understood water in ways we've forgotten. Living between the Tigris and Euphrates, their entire existence depended on the annual flooding of these great rivers. Water brought life. Water brought death. Water was the fundamental substance that could create or destroy with equal indifference. So when they looked back, beyond the founding of their cities, beyond the establishment of their civilization, to imagine what came before everything, they naturally turned to water as the primal element, the substance from which everything emerged, the creative force that made life possible. But Namu was not water as we understand it, not the liquid that flows in rivers or fills our cups. Namu was water as pure potential, water as the substance of possibility, water as the matrix from which all existence would eventually emerge. Think about that for a moment. Not a creator god speaking worlds into existence, not a cosmic intelligence designing reality from nothing, but potential itself, possibility waiting to become actual. The field of all that could be before anything chose to be. From Namu emerged An and Ki, sky and earth. But they were not separate, not yet. They existed in unity, locked in eternal embrace, containing all future possibility within their joined form, but actualizing none of it. This is crucial to understand. The Sumerian cosmology doesn't begin with separation. It begins with union. Heaven and earth were originally one thing, undifferentiated, whole, and in that wholeness, nothing could exist. Because existence requires space, difference, the gap between things. Before the sky lifted away from the earth, there was no space. No room for anything to exist between them, no atmosphere for breath, no gap where life could flourish. Everything that would later fill the cosmos existed only as potential, waiting for the moment of separation. The tablets describe this primordial unity with remarkable consistency across multiple texts. Heaven and earth joined together, An and Ki in eternal embrace, not moving, not changing, not producing anything, just existing in static potential forever. And then came Enlil, Lord of the air, master of breath, commander of the wind, the god whose very nature was the space between things, whose essence was the gap, the opening, the room where existence becomes possible. Enlil thrust the sky upward, forcing An away from Kai. He pushed with tremendous violence. The separation was not gentle, it was not gradual. It was a rupture, a tearing apart, a forceful division of what had been united. And in that violent separation, the world as we know it began. The sky rose up, carried away by An, establishing the celestial realm far above. The earth remained below, claimed by Kai, establishing the terrestrial realm beneath. And between them, in the gap created by their separation, was air, atmosphere, the realm of Enlil. But notice what the tablets do not say. They do not say Enlil created the sky and earth. They say he separated them, as though they already existed, had always existed, and simply needed to be divided to make room for creation. This is not the language of beginning. This is the language of transformation, of reshaping what already was into what could be, and humans were not there to witness it. This is where the timeline becomes strange, because the Sumerian texts make it very clear that vast epochs passed between the separation of heaven and earth and the creation of humanity. Not years, not centuries, ages, eras measured in astronomical cycles, periods so long that human comprehension struggles to grasp them. During this time, the world was organized, the cosmos was structured, divine beings emerged, were born, took positions, established domains. The sun and moon were set in their courses, the stars were arranged in their constellations, the seasons were established, the rivers were made to flow, the mountains were raised, the foundations of reality itself were laid. But by whom? For whom? If humans didn't exist yet, who was this all for? The tablets give us an answer, but it's an answer that fractures our understanding of what the word humanity means. Because the world was organized by divine beings, by the gods themselves, and more specifically by the Anunnaki, that council of great gods, who would later play such a crucial role in the creation of humanity. But before we get to that creation, we need to understand what the pre-human world looked like, because the tablets describe it in remarkable detail, and what they describe is a functioning civilization, not wilderness, not chaos, not a world waiting to be tamed, a world already organized, already productive, already ancient. When archaeologists first translated these creation accounts in the late 1800s, they assumed they were reading origin myths, poetic attempts by ancient people to explain where the world came from, metaphorical stories about how order emerged from chaos, allegories about the establishment of civilization. But the more tablets they uncovered, the stranger the timeline became. Because the Sumerians described a vast expanse of time before humanity entered the picture. Not hundreds of years, not thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Epochs measured not in human lifespans, but in what they called sars, celestial cycles of 300 to 600 years each. The Sumerian king list, that controversial document that has puzzled scholars for over a century, doesn't begin with human kings. It begins with divine ones, 8 rulers who governed before the flood, each reigning for tens of thousands of years. Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years, 8 full sars. Alalgar, who reigned for 36,000 years, 10 sars. Enmenluana, who reigned for 40,000 23,200 years, 12 Sars. The pattern continues through 8 kings, their reigns adding up to 241,200 years total. These are not human spans. These are geological epochs, astronomical ages, time on a scale that predates humanity entirely. But here's what makes this more than just mythology. These numbers aren't random. They're precise multiples of 3,600. They follow a mathematical pattern. They're calculated, deliberate, intentional, as though someone was encoding actual time periods using a standardized unit of measurement. The Babylonians, inheritors of Sumerian knowledge, were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked planetary cycles with remarkable accuracy. They understood that certain celestial alignments repeated at predictable intervals, and one of those intervals, the period it takes for certain planetary configurations to return to their starting positions, is very close to 3,600 years. So when the king list gives us reigns measured in multiples of Sars, it might not be describing individual lifespans at all. It might be describing astronomical epochs, periods of cosmic time, ages measured by the movement of the heavens rather than the beating of human hearts. And during these impossibly long reigns, the tablets say, the world was organized, the cosmos was ordered, the divine principles, the me, were established. Agriculture was developed, architecture was perfected, astronomy was mapped, mathematics was formulated, cities were founded, temples were built, canals were dug, fields were planted. The infrastructure of civilization was established, not by humans, by the gods themselves, or more specifically, by divine workers under the direction of the great gods. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest and most complete Sumerian texts we possess, describes this pre-human period in detail, and what it describes is a functioning divine civilization with a very clear hierarchy and a very real labor problem. At the top were the great Anunnaki, the council of powerful gods who made decisions, decreed fates, and governed the cosmos. Beings like An, the Sky Father, Enlil, the executive god who ran day-to-day operations, Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, Ninhursag, the mother goddess. These were the administrators, the decision-makers, the ruling class of the divine realm. Below them were the Igigi, the younger gods, the divine workforce, and it was the Igigi who did the actual work of building and maintaining the world. They were the ones digging the irrigation canals. They were the ones dredging the rivers. They were the ones raising the temple platforms. They were the ones doing all the back-breaking labor necessary to keep the cosmic order functioning. And they were exhausted. The tablets are very specific about this. For 40 years, some versions say. For 3,600 years, others claim, the Igigi labored without rest. They carried baskets of earth. They dug channels for water. They built foundations for temples. They maintained the infrastructure of reality itself. And they grew weary. Not just tired, weary in a way that became unbearable. The kind of exhaustion that comes from endless labor with no relief in sight, no retirement, no rest, just work. Forever, maintaining a world that seemed to require constant attention. Think about what this implies. The tablets describe divine beings, immortal entities with powers far beyond human capability, struggling with the burden of physical labor, getting tired, growing resentful, approaching a breaking point. This is not the abstract theology of later religions, where gods are omnipotent and beyond physical limitation. This is practical theology. Gods who work, gods who get tired, gods who have labor disputes, gods who need solutions to real organizational problems. And finally, after suffering longer than they could endure, the Igigi rebelled. The tablets describe this rebellion in vivid detail. It happened at night, in secret. The Igigi gathered together, discussed their grievances, and made a collective decision. They would refuse to work any longer. They would confront the great gods directly and demand relief. They surrounded Enlil's temple at Nippur. They set fire to their tools, those symbols of their bondage, those instruments of their endless labor. They shouted and banged on the gates, demanding an audience with the supreme Lord of Earth. Imagine the scene. Divine beings, immortal workers, staging a labor strike against cosmic management, burning their shovels and baskets, refusing to maintain the irrigation canals, letting the fields go unplanted, allowing the cosmic order to begin breaking down because they could no longer bear the burden of maintaining it. Enlil woke to the sound of divine rebellion, and according to the tablets, he was terrified. The God who ruled heaven and earth, who had separated sky from ground, who commanded the winds and storms, was frightened by the revolt of his own workers. He sent for An, his father, the highest god. He sent for Enki, his brother, the clever god of wisdom. A divine council convened in emergency session to address the crisis. What should be done? How could order be restored? How could the work continue if the workers refused to work? Enlil's first instinct was harsh punishment. Find the leaders of the rebellion, execute them, make an example that would frighten the others back into submission, restore order through violence and fear. But Enki, always the voice of wisdom and compassion, offered a different solution. A revolutionary solution, an idea that would change everything. Why not create an entirely new class of beings to do the work? Beings who weren't divine, who could labor without complaint because they wouldn't know any other existence, who could be commanded without rebellion because they would be designed to serve. Why not create humans? The council debated. There were concerns. Would such beings be stable? Could they be controlled? Would they require too much maintenance themselves? But ultimately, faced with divine workers who would no longer work and a cosmic order that required constant maintenance, they agreed. They would create a new species, a worker, a being that could carry the burden of the gods. And they tasked Enki and Ninhursag, the wisest and most skilled of the gods, with the actual work of creation. But before we examine how humanity was made, we need to sit with what this means for everything we think we know about our origins. Because if the tablets are describing something real, something that actually happened, even if filtered through mythological language, then the implications are staggering. It would mean that when humans first appeared, we stepped into a world that already had infrastructure, irrigation systems already dug, fields already planted, temples already standing, cities already planned, knowledge already accumulated. We didn't invent civilization, we inherited it. It would mean that the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in Sumer, the base 60 mathematics, the precise astronomy, the sophisticated architecture, the complex legal systems, wasn't development. It wasn't innovation. It was training. Teaching the new workers how to maintain the systems that already existed. It would mean that the Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were not visitors who arrived to teach primitive humans how to farm and build. They were the original inhabitants, the pre-human civilization, the ones who had built the world before we existed. And we were their solution to a labor problem. Think about Sumerian civilization through this lens. Think about how it appears in the archaeological record. Suddenly, completely, already sophisticated, no developmental stages, no gradual evolution from simple to complex, just immediate competence in mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law, medicine, writing. What if that's because the Sumerians weren't learning these things for the first time? What if they were being taught to maintain systems that had been developed long before they existed? What if they were workers being trained to take over from workers who came before? The tablets say this explicitly. After the great gods had created humanity, after we had been shaped from clay and divine blood, we were immediately put to work, not gradually introduced to civilization. Not given time to develop and evolve, immediately deployed. Let man bear the burden of the gods. Let man carry the basket. Let him dig the canals and tend the fields. Let him build the temples and make the offerings, so the gods may be at leisure We were not created to worship, not initially. We were created to work, to maintain, to serve, to keep running a world that predated us, a civilization that existed before humans did. The method they used to create us is described with a precision that doesn't sound like poetry. It sounds like documentation, like someone trying to preserve the technical details of a process they witnessed or inherited knowledge of, but could not fully explain in the vocabulary available to them. The goddess Nintu, the birth goddess, sometimes called Mami or Beletili, is given the task. She works with Enki, the god of wisdom, the keeper of sacred knowledge, the one who understands the deepest secrets of creation, and the method they use involves combining two distinct components. First, they take clay, earth, physical matter, the substance of the ground itself. This represents the material component, the body, the physical form that the new being will inhabit. But clay alone is not enough. Clay by itself is inert, dead. It has shape but no animation, form but no function. It can be molded but cannot move itself, so they need to add something else, something that will bring the clay to life. They need divine essence, and to obtain it, a god must be sacrificed. The tablets name this god We'ila, sometimes called Geshtu'i. He is described as having intelligence, having temu, having the spark of consciousness that separates thinking beings from mere matter. And he volunteers, or is chosen, to be sacrificed for this purpose. The tablets describe his death in the assembly of the gods. His execution is ritualized, formal. The other gods witness it. His blood is collected carefully. His flesh is preserved, because from his body will come the animating principle that transforms dead clay into living humanity. From the flesh of the god, the spirit remains. Let it proclaim living man as its sign. Let the spirit remain so it is not forgotten. Think about what's being described here. A being with consciousness is killed. His essence is extracted. His blood, which the Sumerians understood as carrying the life force, is mixed with earth. And from that mixture, a new kind of being emerges, one that has a body of earth but a spark of the divine. Nintu takes the clay. She takes the blood. She mixes them together in specific proportions. The tablets don't give us exact ratios, but they make it clear that the mixture must be precise. Too much clay, and the being won't have enough divine essence to function. Too much blood, and the being might become too much like a god, too powerful to control. The balance must be exact, physical enough to be mortal, divine enough to be intelligent, strong enough to work, limited enough to remain obedient. Nintu shapes the mixture. She forms figures. The tablets describe her pinching off pieces, molding them with her hands, working the clay-blood combination into forms that will become the first humans. But she doesn't create just one. She doesn't make a single prototype. She makes 14, 7 males and 7 females, a breeding population, enough genetic diversity to ensure the species can reproduce and continue. And here's where the account becomes even more technical. Nintu doesn't simply speak these beings into existence. She doesn't wave her hand and make them appear. She places them in what the tablets describe as a mold, a womb, a vessel where they gestate. The tablets say the birth goddesses, plural, carry these proto-humans to term. 7 birth goddesses carry the 7 males. 7 other birth goddesses carry the 7 females. They gestate for a specific period, like pregnancy, like biological development. This is not magical creation. This is biological production, manufacturing. The language is industrial, procedural, step by step. Take clay, add blood, mix, shape, place in vessel, gestate, birth. And when the first humans emerge, they are not perfect. This detail is crucial. This is what separates the Sumerian account from later creation myths, where God speaks humanity into perfect existence. The Sumerians describe trial and error, failed attempts, prototypes with defects that need to be corrected. Other texts, particularly the Enki and Ninmah composition, describe this phase in uncomfortable detail. The goddess Ninmah creates the first attempts at humanity, working from Enki's instructions. But something goes wrong. The beings that emerge have problems. One cannot control its bladder, cannot hold back urine, a fundamental biological malfunction. Enki, ever practical, assigns it a role anyway. A servant who doesn't need bladder control, someone who can work in situations where such limitations don't matter. Another cannot speak clearly, cannot form words properly. A neurological defect. Enki makes it a musician, no speech required, just the ability to play instruments and produce sound. A third has poor eyesight, cannot see distant objects or fine details. Enki assigns it tasks that don't require vision, work that can be done by touch or by following simple instructions. A fourth has paralyzed hands, cannot grasp tools or manipulate objects. Again, Enki finds a role, something that doesn't require manual dexterity. The tablets continue through multiple failed prototypes. Beings with physical disabilities, cognitive impairments, biological malfunctions, each one flawed in some way, each one representing an iteration that didn't quite work. And with each failure, Enki and Nintu learn. They adjust the mixture, they refine the process, they experiment with different ratios of clay to blood. They modify the gestation period, they alter the shaping technique. This is not divine perfection. This is research and development. This is engineering through iteration. Trial and error, learning from mistakes, improving the design with each attempt. Think about what that means. It means the Sumerian creation account describes something that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering, like biological manipulation, like the intentional design of a species through controlled experimentation. Take base material, add information, mix according to specific ratios, allow to develop, test the result, identify defects, adjust the process, try again. We read this as metaphor because the alternative is too strange, too advanced for people we've been taught to think of as primitive. But what if the Sumerians were attempting to document a process they'd witnessed or inherited knowledge of? What if they were encoding it in the only framework available to them, mythic narrative, where gods do the work because no other explanation existed for how such sophisticated biological manipulation could occur? The tablets say that eventually, after multiple attempts, after learning from failures, after refining the process, Enki and Nintu succeed. They create humans who are stable, who can reproduce naturally without intervention, who can follow complex instructions, who have the intelligence to learn skills, who have the physical stamina to work continuously, who are, in other words, functional, viable, capable of fulfilling the purpose for which they were designed. Let man bear the burden of the gods. Let man carry the basket. Let him dig the canals and tend the fields. And here, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, is the statement that changes everything about how we understand ourselves. We were not created to worship. We were not fashioned as God's beloved children. We were not made in the divine image for fellowship and spiritual communion. We were manufactured, engineered, designed with a specific function in mind. We were biological machines created to perform labor that divine beings no longer wanted to perform themselves. But notice something else. Notice what was mixed into the clay, divine blood, the essence of a God who had consciousness, intelligence, awareness. The tablets are explicit that this was necessary, that clay alone wouldn't work, that the divine component was essential to create beings who could think, reason, plan, and execute complex tasks. We were designed as workers, but we were workers with a spark of divinity inside us. We had bodies of earth, mortal and temporary, but we had minds touched by the divine, capable of intelligence that approached the gods themselves. This is why the tablets describe the gods as being concerned about humanity, as watching us carefully, as sometimes regretting the creation. Because we were not simple tools. We were not mindless automatons. We were thinking beings, conscious entities. We had just enough divine essence to be unpredictable, to develop our own desires, to potentially rebel, just as the Igigi had rebelled. The creation of humanity was a risk, a calculated risk, but a risk nonetheless. The gods needed workers, but the workers they created had the capacity to become something more, something the gods hadn't fully anticipated, and the tablets suggest they understood this. Because immediately after creating humanity, the gods imposed limitations, built-in constraints designed to keep us manageable, keep us mortal, keep us from becoming too much like gods ourselves. We were given short lifespans compared to divine beings. We were made vulnerable to disease and injury. We were programmed to be fertile enough to replace ourselves, but not so fertile that we'd overwhelm the world. We were given intelligence, but limited knowledge, capacity, but not completion. We were designed to maintain, not to create, to follow, not to lead, to serve, not to rule. But we were also given something the gods perhaps didn't fully appreciate, the ability to learn, the capacity to remember, the tendency to question, the drive to understand, all side effects of the divine essence mixed into the clay. And over time, over generations, we would use those capacities in ways that would surprise our creators. We would develop our own knowledge, build our own systems, create our own civilizations. Eventually, we would even create myths about how we came to be, forgetting that we were once merely workers maintaining someone else's world. But before we get to that forgetting, before we reach the flood that would reset everything, we need to understand what the pre-flood world actually looked like, because the tablets describe it. And what they describe is stranger than we've been willing to admit. The world before the flood was different, not just technologically, not just culturally, different in ways that suggest the basic parameters of existence operated under other rules. Different in ways that make the question of what humanity was before the flood just as important as the question of how we were created. The tablets describe the antediluvian period, the age before the waters came, with a consistency that's difficult to dismiss as pure fantasy. Text after text, across centuries of Sumerian record-keeping, describes the same basic pattern. Before the flood, there was a golden age, a time when heaven and earth were in direct contact, when the gods walked openly among humanity, when knowledge flowed freely, when the divine order was fully operational and humans played their assigned role within it. The king list names 8 kings who ruled during this period. We've already discussed their impossible reign lengths. Alulim for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years, rulers whose lifespans dwarf human possibility. But the tablets don't just give us names and numbers. They describe what these kings did, how they ruled, what the world was like under their governance. And the picture that emerges is of a highly organized, technologically sophisticated, agriculturally productive civilization that spanned tens of thousands of years. These antediluvian kings established cities. 5 cities are named: Eridu, the first city where kingship initially descended from heaven; Bad Tibira, the second city associated with metalworking and craft production; Larak, about which we know less, but which appears to have been connected with healing and purification rituals; Sipar, sacred to the sun god Utu, a center of learning and law; and Shurupak, the final antediluvian city, home of Ziusudra, the flood hero. These weren't primitive settlements. The tablets describe them as fully functioning urban centers, with temples aligned to celestial events, with irrigation systems that controlled the rivers, with agricultural production that fed large populations, with administrative systems that tracked resources, with specialized knowledge in metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. How could cities function for tens of thousands of years? How could knowledge accumulate across such vast time periods? How could institutional memory persist across hundreds of generations? Unless the timescales are real. Unless we're not talking about individual human lifespans, but about something else. Civilizational epochs, cultural periods, astronomical ages. Time measured not by how long people live, but by how long systems persist. Or unless the humans who lived before the flood were different, longer lived, more directly connected to the divine, closer to the gods who created them, less degraded, less limited, less mortal. Some tablets hint at this. They describe antediluvian humanity as stronger than modern humans, as possessing abilities we no longer have, as living in direct communion with the Anunnaki, receiving instruction, guidance, and knowledge without intermediaries. The me, those divine principles that governed civilization, flowed freely during this period. They weren't locked away in temples or controlled by priesthoods. They were accessible. Humanity knew how to cultivate the land because the gods taught agricultural science directly. Humanity knew how to track the stars because the gods provided astronomical instruction. Humanity knew mathematics because the knowledge had been given, not discovered through centuries of trial and error. This was not primitive humanity slowly developing civilization. This was sophisticated humanity maintaining a civilization that had been established by the gods and handed to us complete. Think about the knowledge encoded in Sumerian tablets, the base 60 mathematics, the precise astronomy, the complex legal codes, the medical knowledge, the architectural sophistication. All of it appears suddenly in the archaeological record around 3500 BCE with no clear developmental stages. What if that's because it didn't develop? What if the knowledge was already ancient by the time the Sumerians wrote it down? What if they were preserving information that dated back to the antediluvian period, passed down through oral tradition and finally committed to clay when writing was invented? The tablets themselves suggest this. Over and over, Sumerian texts contain the phrase, "from distant days." Not, "we discovered this," or "we developed this," but "from distant days this knowledge has been practiced." The scribal art has been practiced from distant days. The sacred rituals have been performed from distant days. The divine decrees have been established from distant days. This is the language of preservation, not invention. The language of memory, not innovation. The Sumerians saw themselves as custodians of ancient knowledge, maintainers of systems established long ago, preservers of wisdom that predated their civilization. And if we take them seriously, if we read their own understanding of their own history, then Sumer wasn't the birth of civilization. It was the rebuilding after a catastrophic interruption. But before that interruption, before the flood reset everything, the tablets describe a world that functioned very differently from ours. A world where the boundary between divine and human was permeable, where gods were physically present, where knowledge was transmitted directly rather than discovered gradually. The Atrahasis epic describes this antediluvian period in detail. After humanity was created and deployed as workers, the system functioned smoothly for a time. The Igigi were released from their labor. Humanity took over the work of maintaining the irrigation canals, planting the fields, building and maintaining the temples, keeping the cosmic order running. The gods were satisfied. They received their offerings. They dwelled in their temples. They engaged with humanity directly, teaching, instructing, correcting when necessary. The divine plan was working. But then something unexpected happened. Humanity multiplied. We reproduced faster than the gods had anticipated. We spread across the land. We filled the cities. Our populations grew exponentially. And with our growth came noise. activity, the chaos of dense human civilization. The tablets are specific about this. The noise of humanity disturbed the gods, particularly Enlil, who couldn't rest because of the constant clamor of human life. The sound of cities full of people, the bustle of markets, the crying of children, the arguments and celebrations and daily business of millions of humans going about their lives. Enlil complained to the divine council. Humanity has become too numerous. Their noise is unbearable. They must be reduced, controlled, limited. And so began a series of divine attempts at population control. First, Enlil sent a plague. Disease swept through human populations, reducing our numbers significantly. But we recovered. We adapted. We learned medicinal practices. Our populations rebounded, so Enlil tried drought. He withheld rain. Crops failed. Famine spread. Many died. But again, we adapted. We developed better storage techniques. We improved irrigation. We survived. Then he sent other calamities. Wild beasts to attack settlements, agricultural failures, natural disasters. Each time, humanity was reduced, and each time, humanity recovered. Because we had something the gods hadn't fully accounted for. We had the ability to learn, to innovate, to solve problems, to remember solutions and pass them to the next generation. We were designed as workers, but we had been given divine intelligence to make us effective workers, and that intelligence made us resilient, adaptable, difficult to eliminate. Finally, Enlil reached his breaking point. These half measures weren't working. Humanity kept recovering, kept multiplying, kept making noise. There was only one solution that would work. Total annihilation, a flood, a complete reset. Wipe out humanity entirely and start over. Or better yet, don't start over. Let the world return to the quiet age before humans existed. Let the gods maintain their own civilization, or simply let it fall into peaceful decay. The divine council convened. Enlil presented his plan, a great deluge that would cover the earth, drown every human, destroy every city, erase all evidence that humanity had ever existed, return the world to primordial silence. The gods debated. Some were reluctant. Some saw value in humanity. Some had grown fond of their human servants. But Enlil was insistent, and he was powerful. Lord of the air, commander of storms. He had the ability to make it happen whether the other gods agreed or not. Finally, the council approved. They swore oaths to keep the plan secret. No god would warn humanity of what was coming. The flood would be a surprise. Total, inescapable, final. But one god couldn't bear it. Enki, the god of wisdom, the one who had designed humanity in the first place, couldn't watch his creation be destroyed. He had mixed the divine blood with the clay. He had shaped the first humans. He had taught them skills. He had a connection to humanity that the other gods didn't share. So Enki decided to break his oath, to warn humanity. But he had to do it carefully. He couldn't warn them directly without the other gods discovering his betrayal. He needed a workaround, a technicality that would let him keep the letter of his oath while violating its spirit. He went to the house of Ziusudra, the king of Shurupak, the last antediluvian city, a righteous man, a faithful servant of the gods. And Enki stood outside Ziusudra's reed hut and spoke. Not to Ziusudra himself, but to the wall of the house. He described the coming flood in detail, how the gods had decided to destroy humanity, how the waters would rise, how everything would drown. But he also described how survival was possible. Build a boat, make it waterproof, bring your family, bring craftsmen, bring animals, bring seeds, bring the tools of civilization. Bring the knowledge, save not just lives but memory. Ziusudra, inside his hut, heard everything, and he understood. The god hadn't spoken to him directly. Technically, Enki hadn't broken his oath, but the message had been received, and Ziusudra began to build. The tablets described the construction of the ark in technical detail, specific dimensions, multiple decks, compartments for different purposes, sealed with bitumen to make it watertight, stocked with provisions for a long voyage, with representatives of all living things. But notice what else Ziusudra brought aboard. Not just animals, not just food, but people with skills, craftsmen who knew metalworking, musicians who preserved cultural memory through song, scribes who could write, though writing wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years after the flood. The carriers of knowledge, the ones who remembered. This detail is crucial because it tells us that what survived the flood wasn't just biological, it was cultural, intellectual, technological. The seed of all living things included the seed of civilization itself. The knowledge, the skills, the memory of how things had been before, the blueprint for rebuilding. When the flood came, it came with violence that the tablets struggled to describe. For 7 days and 7 nights the rains fell, the waters rose, the rivers overflowed, the land disappeared beneath churning waves. Everything drowned, every city, every field, every temple, every human, except those aboard Ziusudra's ark. The antediluvian world ended, the age of direct divine contact, the time of golden civilization, the period when humanity knew its purpose and fulfilled it under divine supervision. All of it drowned, erased, silenced. And when the waters finally receded, when Ziusudra opened the door of the ark and looked out at the empty world, what he saw was devastation, mud, silence, the complete erasure of everything that had been. But he also carried something precious, memory, knowledge, the seed of what had been lost, the possibility of rebuilding, not from nothing, but from fragments, from preserved memory, from inherited knowledge, from the teaching of those who had seen the old world and could describe it to those who would build the new one. The antediluvian period ended, but its memory survived, carried in the minds of flood survivors, passed down through oral tradition, eventually written onto clay tablets by scribes who understood they were preserving something far older than their own civilization, something that predated even the first Sumerian cities. The memory of a world before the flood, a world where humans knew their origin, knew they had been created by the Anunnaki as workers, knew the gods walked among them, knew that civilization had been given, not developed, knew that they were maintaining something ancient rather than inventing something new. And if that memory is accurate, if the tablets preserve genuine knowledge of the antediluvian world, then everything after the flood is rebuilding, restoration, the attempt to recover what was lost, which brings us to the question that haunts every fragment of Sumerian literature. What exactly was lost in the flood, and how much of it did the survivors manage to save? When Ziusudra emerged from the ark after the waters receded, he performed a ritual that the tablets describe with careful attention to detail. He built an altar. He slaughtered animals as offerings. He made sacrifice to the gods, and the gods, who had been without human offerings for 7 days, descended to the smoke like flies drawn to sweetness. This image is remarkable. The gods, powerful and divine, are described as starving, desperate for the sustenance provided by human worship and sacrifice. They had tried to destroy humanity, but in doing so, they had nearly destroyed themselves, because they needed us more than they had realized. The Atrahasis epic describes the gods gathering around Ziusudra's sacrifice with desperation. They had been without offerings during the flood, without the rituals humanity performed, without the maintenance of the cosmic order that human labor provided. And they discovered, too late, that they had become dependent on the species they had created. Enlil arrived at the sacrifice and was furious. Humans had survived. His plan for total annihilation had failed. Someone had betrayed the divine council and warned Ziusudra. He demanded to know who had broken their oath, who had undermined his decree. The tablets describe a tense confrontation between Enlil and Enki. Accusations, denials. The clever god defending his actions by arguing that complete destruction of humanity would have been a mistake, that the gods needed human workers, that the loss of humanity would have meant the loss of the entire system that the gods had established. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but limitations would be imposed. Deliberate constraints built into post-flood humanity to prevent the problems that had led to the flood in the first place. Human lifespans would be shortened. Before the flood, the tablets suggest, humans lived much longer. Not as long as gods, but long enough to accumulate significant knowledge and memory. After the flood, that would change. Humans would die younger. Each generation would have less time to learn and remember. Fertility would be limited. Not every woman would be able to bear children. Some would be barren. Some priestesses would be required to remain celibate. Infant mortality would increase. Not every child would survive to adulthood. These weren't natural limitations. According to the tablets, they were deliberate design choices, population controls built into the species to prevent us from multiplying as rapidly as we had before the flood. Disease would be introduced. Before the flood, humanity seems to have been more resistant to illness. After the flood, we would be vulnerable. Sickness would reduce our numbers and limit our effectiveness, and most significantly, the direct connection to the divine would be severed. Before the flood, the gods walked among humans, taught us directly, provided immediate feedback and instruction. After the flood, that intimacy would end. The gods would withdraw. They would work through intermediaries, through kings who claimed divine mandate, through priests who interpreted divine will, through omens and dreams rather than direct speech. Humanity would have to maintain civilization with less guidance, with fragmented knowledge, with memory that had been interrupted. We would have to rebuild based on what survivors remembered, knowing that their memory was incomplete. This is what the tablets describe: a deliberate reduction, a planned limitation. Post-flood humanity was redesigned to be less capable than antediluvian humanity, less connected, less knowledgeable, more forgetful. But even with these limitations, the survivors carried something precious. They carried fragments of the old knowledge, pieces of the system that had existed before, and they were determined to preserve it, to pass it down, to rebuild as much as they could. When you excavate beneath a Sumerian city, you find something strange. You find that the city is built on ruins, layer upon layer of earlier settlements, each one destroyed or abandoned, each one built over, as though the Sumerians were constantly trying to rebuild something they could never quite recover. At Eridu, archaeologists discovered temple upon temple upon temple, 16 successive temples built on the exact same spot across nearly 5,000 years, each one built directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, each one maintaining the same orientation, the same basic design, the same sacred alignment. Why build the same structure over and over in the same place? Why not build somewhere else? Why maintain that continuity across millennia? Unless they were trying to preserve something. Unless that spot held significance that predated all of them, unless they were maintaining a connection to something older, a location that had been sacred before the flood, a place where divine contact had occurred, a site they were trying to keep active through constant rebuilding. The same pattern appears at Nippur, at Ur, at every major Sumerian city, temples built and rebuilt on the same sacred ground, cities that seem to be remembering something, following a pattern established long ago, and the knowledge they preserved in their tablets shows the same quality. It appears complete, sophisticated, as though it had been inherited rather than developed. Base 60 mathematics showing up fully formed. Astronomical observations requiring centuries of data appearing in the earliest texts. Architectural knowledge that seems to skip developmental stages. The standard explanation is that we simply haven't found the earlier stages. that the developmental period existed but has been lost to erosion and time. But what if the Sumerians are telling us the truth? What if they inherited this knowledge from flood survivors who had lived in the antediluvian world? Consider their astronomical knowledge. The tablets track Venus with precision. They know the planet's 584-day synodic cycle. They understand the movements of Jupiter and Saturn. They recognize patterns in the stars that take decades to observe and record. How did the first civilization acquire this knowledge? How did people who supposedly just invented writing have star charts that match modern observations? Unless they didn't invent the knowledge, unless they received it. Unless survivors of the flood brought astronomical data that had been accumulated over vast periods in the antediluvian world. Data that couldn't be recreated quickly, but could be preserved if someone remembered it. The same logic applies to mathematics. Base 60 isn't an obvious choice. Base 10 makes more sense for a species with 10 fingers. But base 60 has mathematical advantages. It's highly divisible. It works elegantly for fractions and astronomical calculations. It's the superior system if you understand its properties. Did the Sumerians figure this out themselves? Did they test different numerical bases and determine that 60 was optimal? Or did they inherit a system that had been developed long before, in the antediluvian period, when knowledge was accumulated across tens of thousands of years? The tablets themselves suggest the latter. From distant days they repeat. From distant days the scribal art has been practiced. From distant days the divine principles have been established. From distant days this knowledge has existed. They're not claiming to be the inventors. They're claiming to be the preservers, the ones who saved what could be saved, the ones who wrote down what survivors remembered before the memory faded completely. And if that's true, then every Sumerian tablet is a fragment, a piece of a much larger body of knowledge that existed before the flood, a preserved remnant of antediluvian wisdom. Think about the king list again. 8 kings ruling for hundreds of thousands of years, then the flood, then kings with normal human lifespans. The transition is abrupt, the timeline is divided, before and after. What if the antediluvian section preserves actual chronology, not individual lifespans, but institutional memory? 8 successive periods of organized civilization spanning 200 years. 8 epochs of knowledge accumulation. 8 ages when the divine civilization functioned and humans maintained it. Then the flood erased it all, and the post-flood section records the rebuilding, the attempt to restore kingship, to re-establish the system, to maintain as much continuity as possible with what had been lost. The tablets describe kingship being lowered from heaven again after the flood, not given for the first time, given again, restored, as though it had existed before, had been interrupted, and now needed to be re-established. This is the language of restoration, of maintaining continuity across catastrophe, of refusing to let memory die even when the world that created that memory has drowned. And the Sumerians succeeded. For 3,000 years they maintained their civilization. They copied the old tablets. They preserved the ancient knowledge. They taught their children the mathematics and astronomy that had been passed down. They rebuilt the temples on the old foundations. They maintained the connection until eventually they too fell. Conquered by Akkadians, absorbed into Babylonian culture, their cities abandoned, their language dying, their tablets buried beneath sand. But even in death, they continued to transmit, because the Babylonians copied their texts. The Assyrians preserved their knowledge. Later cultures studied their mathematics and astronomy. The knowledge continued to flow, even as the people who had first preserved it disappeared. And now, 5,000 years after the last Sumerian city fell, we sit in museums and study their tablets. We translate their language, we decode their mathematics, we trace their astronomy, we excavate their cities. And we find fragments, pieces of something vast, echoes of a knowledge system that predates them. hints of an antediluvian world they were trying to preserve. We find tablet after tablet saying the same thing. From distant days, knowledge was given, kingship descended from heaven. This is the restoration of what was before. They're not claiming to be the origin, they're claiming to be the bridge. The connection between what was before the flood and what came after. The ones who caught the fragments as the old world drowned and held them safe until writing could preserve them permanently. And if we take them seriously, if we read what they actually wrote instead of imposing our assumptions onto their texts, then the picture that emerges is revolutionary. Humanity was created before the flood by the Anunnaki as workers to maintain a divine civilization. We lived in that world for an unknown length of time, learning the systems, accumulating knowledge, developing skills. Then the flood came and destroyed everything. But survivors preserved what they could. They carried memory. They maintained knowledge. They passed down skills. They remembered the old world and tried to rebuild it. And when writing was finally developed around 3500 BCE, they pressed that memory into clay. They encoded the knowledge into tablets. They preserved the story of what humanity had been before the flood. That's why Sumerian civilization appears so suddenly. That's why its knowledge seems so advanced. That's why it looks like it was inherited rather than developed. Because it was inherited. From flood survivors who remembered the antediluvian world, who carried fragments of that ancient civilization forward, who refused to let humanity forget what it had once been. The Sumerians were not the first civilization, they were the first rebuilders, the first successful attempt to restore what the flood had destroyed, the bridge between the antediluvian world and everything that came after. And every tablet they wrote, every temple they built, every mathematical formula they preserved, every star chart they recorded was an act of remembrance, a way of saying we were more than this. Before the flood, we knew more. We were part of something greater, and we will not forget. But if all of this is true, if the tablets are preserving genuine memory of a pre-flood world where humanity was created by the Anunnaki as workers in a divine civilization, then we must confront the question that makes everything else seem small by comparison. Who were the Anunnaki? Not in the mythological sense, not as characters in a story, but actually, really, what were they? The tablets described them with consistency across thousands of years of Mesopotamian record-keeping. They were the great gods, the council of powerful beings who decreed fates, the ones who separated heaven from earth, the ones who organized the cosmos, the ones who created humanity. They had names: An, the Sky Father; Enlil, the Lord of Air; Enki, the God of Wisdom; Ninhursag, the Mother Goddess; Inanna, the Goddess of Love and War; Utu, the Sun God; Nanna, the Moon God; dozens of others, each with specific domains, specific responsibilities, specific personalities. They were described as radiant, glowing, wearing crowns with horns, symbols of divinity, moving between heaven and earth in vessels the texts struggle to name, speaking in voices that thundered, possessing knowledge that humanity could barely comprehend. But they were not omnipotent, not all-knowing, not perfect. They made mistakes, they changed their minds, they argued with each other, they experienced emotions, they needed things, they got tired. They required sustenance provided by human offerings. They were powerful, yes, far beyond human capability, but they were limited, constrained, operating within rules they themselves hadn't created, subject to cosmic laws they had to obey. This description doesn't sound like the infinite gods of later monotheistic religions. It sounds like something else. Advanced beings, survivors of an even earlier civilization, entities from somewhere else who came to this planet and organized it. Humanity from a previous cycle who had evolved or been modified beyond recognition. The ancient astronaut theorists, following Zecharia Sitchin's interpretations, claim the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials. Beings from another planet who came to Earth for resources, created humanity through genetic engineering, and eventually departed, leaving us with confused myths about gods. Mainstream scholars reject this interpretation completely. They point out that Sitchin mistranslated key terms, that his astronomical claims are wrong, that the tablets don't actually describe spacecraft or genetic laboratories, that the Anunnaki were mythological gods, personifications of natural forces, archetypes representing aspects of human psychology and cosmology. Both interpretations have problems. The extraterrestrial interpretation requires us to read advanced technology into texts that use mythological language. It requires us to assume that ancient people witnessed biological engineering and could only describe it as gods mixing clay with blood. It requires planetary mechanics that don't work and astronomical claims that can't be verified. But the purely mythological interpretation also struggles to explain certain things. Why do the creation accounts describe trial and error? Why is there such specificity about the process of making humans? Why does the knowledge appear inherited rather than developed? Why do the Sumerians themselves insist they're preserving memory rather than inventing stories? There's a third possibility that neither side wants to examine seriously. What if the Anunnaki were human? Not modern humans, not Homo sapiens as we currently exist, but human in the sense of being from Earth, from this planet, evolved here or modified here, part of a previous cycle of civilization that predates our own. What if the flood wasn't the first reset? What if human history is cyclical? What if civilizations rise, accumulate knowledge, reach advanced states, and then collapse back to near zero through catastrophe? What if this has happened multiple times? What if the Anunnaki were survivors of a previous cycle, a previous civilization that had reached technological sophistication we can barely imagine? Who survived some earlier catastrophe? Who found themselves in a world that had been reset? Who decided to create workers to help rebuild? Who used whatever biological knowledge they possessed to engineer a new human variant optimized for labor? In this scenario, the tablets would be describing something real. Gods who walked the earth would be advanced humans who seemed godlike to the primitive survivors around them. Creation through clay and divine blood would be their attempt to describe biological engineering using the only vocabulary they had. The flood would be a genuine catastrophe that destroyed their civilization and forced another reset. And we, modern humans, would be their creation, their workers, their attempt to rebuild, carrying within us genetic echoes of their modification, living in a world they organized, using knowledge they preserved, following patterns they established. This interpretation has the advantage of taking the tablets seriously without requiring extraterrestrials. It explains why the Anunnaki seem so human in their emotions and limitations. It explains why their technology appears godlike but not actually magical. It explains why knowledge seems inherited from somewhere but we can't trace its origin. And it aligns with something we're discovering through modern archaeology. Evidence of sophisticated cultures existing far earlier than we thought possible. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built 11,600 years ago by people we thought were simple hunter-gatherers. Yet they moved stones weighing dozens of tons and carved complex iconography, submerged ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, structures that would have been built when those areas were above water, before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age around 10,000 years ago. Ancient maps that show coastlines as they existed before the Ice Age. The Piri Race Map, the Oronteus Phineus Map, showing Antarctica without ice, showing details that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 20th century. Ancient astronomical knowledge that seems too sophisticated for the cultures that possessed it. The Antikythera mechanism, a complex gear-based computer from ancient Greece. The precise astronomical alignments of monuments worldwide, the mathematical sophistication encoded in structures like the Great Pyramid, all of this suggests that advanced knowledge existed earlier than we've admitted. That civilization might be older than we think, that previous cycles might have reached heights we're only now beginning to suspect. And if previous civilizations rose to advanced states before collapsing, if knowledge has been lost and recovered multiple times, if we're living in a rebuilding period after some ancient catastrophe, then the Sumerian tablets aren't fantasy. They're documentation, fragmented, mythologized, filtered through limited vocabulary, but fundamentally preserving real memory of real events. The Anunnaki would be the survivors of the previous cycle, the ones who remembered what had been lost, who possessed remnants of advanced knowledge, who seemed godlike to those around them, who attempted to recreate civilization by creating workers who could help maintain it. And we would be those workers, still fulfilling our designed purpose thousands of years later, still maintaining civilizations we didn't originally create, still carrying within our DNA the modifications they introduced, still following patterns they established so long ago that we've forgotten they were ever designed. This is speculation, of course. We can't prove any of this. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary. The tablets are ambiguous. The timeline is uncertain. Multiple interpretations remain possible. But what we can say with certainty is this. The Sumerians believed they were preserving genuine memory. They believed knowledge had been inherited from an earlier age. They believed humanity had been created with a specific purpose. They believed a great flood had destroyed an advanced antediluvian civilization. They believed they were rebuilding rather than inventing. And they went to extraordinary lengths to preserve that belief, copying tablets across centuries, maintaining temples on ancient foundations, teaching mathematics and astronomy that had been passed down, performing rituals whose original meaning had been lost, but which they continued anyway because the ancestors had commanded it. This is not the behavior of people inventing myths. This is the behavior of people desperately trying to prevent forgetting, people who understood that knowledge could be lost, that civilizations could collapse, that memory was fragile and required constant maintenance. They built in stone when they could, because stone lasts longer than clay. They wrote in clay because clay survives fire and water. They taught their children because oral transmission was the most reliable backup system. They encoded knowledge into ritual so that even if the meaning was lost, the practice would continue. They were fighting against forgetting, against the entropy that erodes memory, against the tendency of civilizations to lose connection with their past. They were trying to build bridges across time, to send messages to the future, to warn us or teach us or simply remind us that we come from somewhere, that our origin story is older than we think, that what we call the beginning might be a middle chapter in a much longer tale. If the Sumerian tablets preserve memory of humanity's true origin, if we were created by previous humans to serve as workers in their rebuilding civilization, then every assumption we hold about human nature, about consciousness, about our place in the universe, inverts. We are not the result of blind evolution. We are engineered. We are not the pinnacle of creation. We are tools. We are not discovering knowledge for the first time. We are recovering what was lost. We are not inventing civilization. We are maintaining a system designed by others. Think about what that means for consciousness itself. The tablets say we were made from clay and divine blood, earth and essence, body and spirit. The material component from the planet itself, the animating principle from the gods who created us. If we translate that out of mythological language, what are they describing? Physical bodies constructed from earthly materials. Consciousness derived from or copied from the creators. We would be biological machines running software that originated somewhere else, uploaded, inherited, or implanted into physical forms designed to house it. This sounds like science fiction, but it's what the tablets say. divine essence mixed with earth to create beings who could think, reason, and follow complex instructions. Consciousness that didn't evolve naturally but was transferred, implanted, given. Modern neuroscience struggles to explain consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from physical brain processes? How does matter become aware of itself? Why is there something it's like to be us? What if consciousness doesn't arise from physical processes? What if it's not emergent from complexity? What if it's something that can be transferred, copied, encoded? What if the gods giving us divine essence was their way of describing consciousness transfer? We have no framework for this in our current science, but we also can't explain consciousness within our current framework. We know brains correlate with consciousness. We can't explain why brains produce consciousness in the first place. The mechanism remains mysterious. The Sumerian creation account offers an answer. Consciousness was given to us, transferred from beings who already possessed it, mixed into biological forms designed to house it. We are receivers, not originators, carriers, not creators. If that's true, then consciousness predates humanity. It existed in the Anunnaki, and possibly in whatever created them, and possibly in whatever created that. Consciousness is something fundamental, something that gets transferred, copied, encoded into successive forms as civilizations rise and fall and rise again. This raises questions that spiral outward infinitely. If the Anunnaki created us, who created them? If they were survivors of a previous civilization, what created that civilization? Is there an original source? Or is it turtles all the way down? An infinite regression of created creators? The tablets hint at this. They describe generations of gods before the Anunnaki, primordial deities who emerged from Namu, the cosmic ocean, parent gods who birthed other gods who eventually created humanity. Each generation looking back at their predecessors as the ancient ones, the first ones, but none of them actually being the first. Maybe that's the deepest truth the tablets preserve, that there is no first, that creation is cyclical, that consciousness is fundamental and eternal, but forms are temporary, bodies wear out, civilizations collapse, species go extinct, but consciousness persists, transferring to new forms, new carriers, new expressions. We are the current carriers, the latest expression, the newest upload running on biological hardware engineered by previous carriers who needed workers to maintain their world. And if the pattern holds, if the cycle continues, eventually we will collapse. Another catastrophe will come, another reset, another flood, whether of water or fire or something else. And if anyone survives, they will have to rebuild, create new workers, transfer consciousness into new forms, continue the cycle. Maybe they'll remember us the way we remember the Anunnaki, as the ancient ones, the gods who walked the earth before the great catastrophe, the ones who possessed knowledge we're trying to recover. Maybe they'll find our records, our hard drives, our books, and struggle to understand what we were trying to tell them. Maybe they'll debate whether we were real or mythological, whether our technology was actual or metaphorical, whether the smartphones and satellites and computers we described were genuine devices or poetic descriptions of things they don't have words for. Maybe they'll preserve fragments of our knowledge without fully understanding it, teaching mathematics we developed, using technologies we invented, following patterns we established, maintaining systems we built, all while not quite remembering that we're the ones who gave it to them. This is the cycle. This is what the tablets preserve. Memory of the cycle, documentation that it has happened before, warning that it will happen again, instruction for how to survive it, how to preserve knowledge across the gap, how to rebuild, how to create workers, how to transfer consciousness, how to maintain continuity. The Sumerians understood this. That's why they wrote so obsessively. That's why they built in stone. That's why they encoded knowledge into every possible medium. clay tablets, temple walls, astronomical alignments, mathematical ratios, ritual practices, oral traditions. They were building redundancy into the transmission, making sure the message would survive even if most of the carriers were destroyed. And we, modern humans, are receiving that message now, 5,000 years later. Across a gap of languages and cultures and worldviews, we're reading their tablets, excavating their cities, deciphering their mathematics, tracking their astronomy, trying to understand what they were telling us. And what they were telling us is this: you are not the beginning. You come from somewhere. You were made for a purpose. You are maintaining something older than you realize. And this has all happened before. Before the Anunnaki, there were others. Before those others, there were others still. The regression continues backward beyond the horizon of preserved memory, each cycle preserving fragments from the previous one. Each generation of creators looking back at their creators with the same questions we're asking now. Where did we come from? Who made us? What were we designed to do? Is this the first time? Or have we been created and destroyed and created again across depths of time we can barely imagine? The tablets don't give us final answers. They give us fragments. Pieces of a story so old that even they had lost the beginning. They preserved what they could, passed it forward, trusted that someday someone would understand what they were trying to say. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that we're meant to continue the transmission. That our job is not just to receive the message, but to preserve it for whoever comes after. To make sure the knowledge survives the next reset. To become the Anunnaki for the next cycle, to create workers who will maintain what we built, to transfer consciousness into new forms, to preserve fragments of our knowledge, to encode our warnings into whatever medium will survive, to build monuments that will last, to write texts that will be found, to leave evidence that we were here, that we knew something, that we were part of a longer story. And to pray that whoever finds our evidence doesn't dismiss it as myth, doesn't explain it away as primitive superstition, doesn't reduce our documentation to metaphor and allegory, but reads it seriously, considers the possibility that we were telling the truth, that we were preserving memory, that we knew what we were talking about because we had received the knowledge from those who came before. This is what the Sumerian tablets ask of us. Not to believe without question, not to abandon critical thinking, but to consider seriously that they might be preserving something real, that their creation accounts might be documentation, that their flood stories might be history, that their claims about inherited knowledge might be accurate, to ask ourselves whether we're willing to examine the possibility that human civilization is older than we've been taught. That advanced knowledge existed earlier than we've admitted, that previous cycles reached heights we're only now recovering, that we are not the first to reach our current level, and that we won't be the last, to sit with the uncomfortable recognition that we might be living in a rebuilding period, that what we call progress might be recovery, that our innovations might be reinventions, that our discoveries might be rediscoveries, that the ancient wisdom we're finally beginning to respect might be fragments of scientific knowledge from previous cycles that we're only now sophisticated enough to recognize as science. The tablets are patient. They've waited 5,000 years. They can wait longer, but they're also fragile. Clay erodes. Languages die. Knowledge is lost. Every generation that passes without understanding them is another opportunity for the message to be missed, for the warning to go unheeded, for the memory to fade completely. We stand at a unique moment in history. We have the technology to read the tablets. We have the archaeological evidence to verify their claims about the flood. We have the linguistic tools to translate their language. We have the mathematical sophistication to recognize the knowledge encoded in their texts. We have the astronomical knowledge to confirm their star charts. We have the biological understanding to recognize what they might mean by mixing clay with divine blood. We have everything we need to understand what they were trying to tell us. The only question is whether we're willing to listen. In a museum somewhere, a clay tablet sits behind glass. The temperature is controlled. The humidity is regulated. The lighting is minimal to prevent degradation. Every possible measure is taken to preserve this fragment of humanity's oldest written memory. On its surface, wedge-shaped marks crowd together. Hundreds of tiny impressions pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago by someone who believed what they were recording mattered enough to outlast them, and they were right. The tablet survived. The empires that surrounded it fell. The language that created it died. The civilization that produced it vanished. But the clay remained. And if you look closely at the edges, at the places where fingers gripped the tablet while the stylus pressed into its surface, you can see them. Fingerprints, the ridges and whorls of a human hand, someone who lived before Egypt, before Greece, before Rome, before anything we typically think of as ancient history. They touched this clay. They held it while writing. They left their mark impressed into the surface, preserved for millennia. And if you could somehow reach through the glass, through time itself, and press your own finger into that same spot, you would touch them, bridge the gap of 5,000 years, connect with the person who made this tablet, and you would realize something profound. They were human, just like you. They had the same kind of consciousness, the same capacity for wonder, the same need to preserve, the same fear of being forgotten. They looked at the stars and asked questions. They wanted to understand where they came from. They were trying to figure out the same mysteries that keep us awake at night. And they wrote down what they believed to be true. Not to deceive, not to create entertaining fiction. They documented what they understood about humanity's origin, about the gods who created us, about the world before the flood, about the knowledge that had been inherited and needed to be preserved. They were the bridge between the antediluvian world and everything that came after. They caught the fragments as the old world drowned. They held them safe through the rebuilding. They pressed them into clay so the memory would survive when oral tradition failed. And now we have those fragments. We have their tablets. We have their cities buried beneath sand. We have their mathematics encoded in our clocks. We have their astronomy confirmed by modern instruments. We have their mythology echoing through every religion that came after. We have their message, and the message is clear even if we're not ready to hear it. You are not the beginning. You come from somewhere older. You were made for a purpose. You are maintaining something that predates you. This has all happened before, and it will happen again. The question is what we do with that message. Do we dismiss it? Explain it away? Reduce it to primitive myth? Or do we take it seriously? Consider the possibility that they knew something we've forgotten, that they were documenting rather than inventing, that they were preserving genuine memory of humanity's origin before humans existed as we currently are. The tablets can't force us to believe. They can only wait. They've been waiting for 5,000 years. They can wait longer. But every year that passes, more clay erodes. More tablets crumble. More knowledge is lost, the message is fading, and if we lose it completely, if the last tablet crumbles to dust before we understand what it's trying to tell us, then we lose more than ancient history. We lose memory of where we came from. We lose connection to the cycle. We lose the warnings about what's coming. We lose the instructions for how to survive it. We become like humanity immediately after the flood, starting over with no memory of what came before, rebuilding from scratch, relearning everything, rediscovering knowledge that was already known, reinventing technologies that already existed, going through the whole painful process again because we couldn't preserve the memory. Unless we listen now, unless we take the tablets seriously, unless we examine the possibility that the Sumerians were telling the truth, that they were documenting real events, that they inherited real knowledge from survivors of a real antediluvian civilization, that they were preserving memory of humanity's actual origin. The clay is patient, but it's not eternal. The fingerprints are still visible, but they're fading. The wedges are still readable, but they're eroding. The message is still there, but it's disappearing. And if we lose it, we lose more than we can imagine. We lose our origin story, our deep history, our connection to what came before. And maybe that is the real test hidden inside the clay. Not whether we can prove every line beyond doubt, not whether we can force the past to speak in the language of modern certainty, but whether we can become the kind of civilization that does not forget. Because if the tablets are right, even in the loose, dreamlike way that ancient truth often is, then the most dangerous thing about the next catastrophe will not be the water. It will be the silence afterward. A world where survivors walk among ruins with no map of what was lost. A world where knowledge has to be reinvented through suffering. A world where the cycle repeats because memory failed. And that means the question is no longer only about the Anunnaki, or Sumer, or the flood. The question is about us. What do we choose to preserve? What do we choose to encode into something stronger than our bodies? What do we choose to pass forward in a form that can outlive language, empire, and even belief? Because right now we are leaving our own tablets. Not in clay, but in servers, in satellites, in hard drives, in fragile glass fibers beneath oceans. We are writing our story in a medium that feels eternal, until you remember how quickly electricity dies. One solar storm, one war that shatters infrastructure, one slow collapse where maintenance stops and the system we trust begins to rot. And then what? Will anyone be able to read our archives? Will our knowledge survive the gap between worlds? Or will it become the next myth, half-remembered, argued over, reshaped into symbols by people who no longer know the meaning of the words? Because that is what time does. It does not only destroy, it transforms. A scientific fact becomes a legend. A machine becomes a chariot of fire. A laboratory becomes a temple. A technological process becomes the mixing of clay and blood. And perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps that is the only way memory survives at all. Maybe the Sumerians weren't wrong to speak in gods and oceans and sacred blood. Maybe that was the format required to carry truth across thousands of years. A story strong enough to outlive its own civilization. And if that is true, then those tablets were never meant to end the debate. They were meant to start a responsibility, to whisper to the future, don't assume you are the first. Don't assume you will be the last, and don't assume the world will always be stable enough to hold what you know. The clay does not shout. It doesn't demand belief. It just remains. And in that patience, it offers one final image, a city after the flood. Not the glorious Uruk of hymns and kings, but a rebuilt Uruk, smaller, humbler, half-remembered, bricks stacked on older bricks, temples raised on drowned foundations, a people who inherited fragments and tried to make them whole. You can almost see them at dusk in the pale light, carrying baskets of mud, shaping bricks, rebuilding walls. Not because they understood everything, but because they refused to let everything vanish. And somewhere among them, a scribe sits down. He smooths a slab of wet clay. He lifts a reed stylus, and he presses the first wedge, a simple mark, then another. He is not writing entertainment. He is building a bridge from distant days, from drowned cities, from names that will one day be mispronounced, from gods that will one day be called myths, and he writes the only thing he can truly give to the future, a memory. Because the flood does not only destroy buildings, it destroys continuity, and continuity is the most fragile miracle civilization ever creates. So tonight, as the world grows quieter, let the question settle softly. Not, Were the Anunnaki aliens? Not, did the flood happen exactly like this, but something simpler, something heavier. If the cycle comes again, will we leave anything that can be understood? Will we build a bridge strong enough for whoever wakes up after the waters recede? And if we do, they will read our fragments the way we read the Sumerians, with doubt, with wonder, with arguments, with theories, but also with that strange feeling that the past is not dead, that it is watching us through fingerprints in clay. In the museum, the tablet rests behind glass, silent, patient. The lights are low, the air is controlled, and still, slowly, invisibly, time continues its work. But for now, the wedges remain, and as long as they remain, the message remains. You are not the beginning. You come from somewhere older, and what you become depends on what you choose to remember. So let the clay sit with you, let the thought drift, and when you're ready, let your eyes grow heavy, because the ruins will still be there tomorrow, the tablets will still be waiting, and the story, whatever it truly was, will still be whispering quietly beneath the dust. Good night.